Hello everyone, and welcome to this introduction module to the Procedural Asset Production Masterclass. In this video, I'd like to go over how we can organize our node networks, because a clean node network is usually useful all around. If we ever need to hand off our node networks to other people, having a properly annotated and organized node network will make it a lot easier to understand. And even for ourselves, having our node networks properly labeled, colored, and organized is always a plus. So let's go to Houdini and let's get started. So over here I've set up a little scene and all my nodes are currently spread out over my network. So the first thing I would like to do is show you how you can find a node in a node network. And to do that, we can press Ctrl F when we're hovering over the network view. And this will bring up the Find Node tool. And the Find Node tool will allow us to find any node in our network based on its name or several other filter categories. We can also filter on parameter values, even snippets from script nodes like the wrangle, and even the node type. So if we have a particular Houdini digital asset or particular node type we want to find, we can find it here. So first let's have a look and see if we can find one of our spheres. So if I type sphere, Houdini will come up with every sphere currently in our network. And if we click on one of these, it will navigate towards them. Now right now we are only looking at our current level in the network. If we want to look at multiple levels, such as the sphere inside of our subnetwork here, then we can also search for child networks. And this will help us find specific nodes that are not inside our current network. So if we click on that, we now go inside. This button over here will also allow us to search inside of locked node networks. If we click on that and I remove my search parameter and maybe type in an asterisk, it will find every single node inside my scene. Some of which will probably also be located inside some of our mountain nodes, because our mountain nodes are actually locked assets. If I untag this, then whatever's inside of our mountain nodes will disappear and the list becomes a lot shorter. So we'll be using this tool a lot more when we are using the class to quickly locate certain tools. But let's continue on to the next topic for now. So let's say we have our node network. Let's go back to the top level. And it becomes very large, or our nodes are somewhat spaced out. If we want to find where we are inside of our network, so we can keep ourselves grounded, we can press the O key, and this will bring up the network overview. Now, the network overview creates a little zoomed out image, depending on the size of our network, and we have this purple screen here that shows us where inside the network we're actually looking. Now right now, the network overview is set to automatic mode. If I go to my Tools tab up here, we can also make sure that it always appears. And if we do that, then no matter where we are in the network, it will be visible in our screen. Or we can of course turn it off. We can turn it back on with the O key. So the O key basically just toggles between the never state and whatever other state it was last set to. You probably just want to keep it on when needed, because you don't need it when you are able to see everything. Next, maybe we want to be able to set a couple of hotkeys for ourselves. So if we press Ctrl 1, you will create a Quickmark. And then if I move my camera somewhere else, if I press 1, as long as my mouse is inside of the network view, we will move over to that Quickmark. We do the same for, say, other parts of our network. So if I go inside of my subnet and I press Ctrl 2 and I switch between 1 and 2, I now jump between those 2 points, even between subnet levels. So that can be pretty useful if you need to constantly go to a particular part of your network. So the network editor comes with a couple of useful layout tools. If we go to the Layout tab, we can find several of them right here. And the first one we can use is Shift L. Shift L will take whatever we have selected, and if we press it, we'll lay out our nodes in a somewhat clean way. Personally, I find that depending on the complexity of your network, this can create quite some chaotic shapes. I don't personally like it too much, but for small networks like this, it produces pretty good results. We can also affect all the nodes currently in our scene by pressing the L key, and doing this will lay out all our nodes nicely inside our scene. Again, like I mentioned, larger networks will probably get a bit messy. Doing this often messes up my node networks, so personally, I don't like doing this. In fact, the bigger your networks get, the more problematic pressing the L key by accident becomes. But let's say we want to customize our node positions a little bit more ourselves, so we have a bit more control over their layout. Well, for that we can use the Layouts button as well. Under here we can use the Align Nodes Horizontally or Vertically function. And this works well if you just need a couple of nodes to lay out in the same plane. However, if you have multiple nodes selected and you use the same function, they will all collapse on top of each other. So again, be careful how you use this. You can also use the feature right below to distribute nodes vertically and horizontally. And this is a little bit more controlled. Nodes will then try to line themselves up in a more controlled manner. Next, we can space our nodes vertically or horizontally, and this will basically spread them out, so we have a bit more space between them. In general, I don't tend to use these tools too much, but if you have a large node network that you want to try and organize every so once in a while, if it hasn't been organized yet, if you get it from someone else, then these functions can save you some time. So the next thing I would like to show you is how we can actually line up our nodes a bit more by hand. So I'm going to grab my nodes here, and I would like to activate the grid view. Under Tools, if we go and scroll down, we can find Show Grid. And we can show our grid in two different ways. We can show it as points, which will give us this pointed view. Personally, I'm not a fan. But then we also have the lines mode, which create a more easy to look at view. And our nodes will try to snap to the points the moment you get close. So you can use this to lay out your nodes in a bit more of a predictable and nicely laid out manner. Though you might notice that when you're actually trying to move your nodes, even without the grid, so let's turn it off again, nodes will try to line up with one another. You'll get this dotted line appear when you have them right below each other or next to one another. So we can still organize our nodes to be in a somewhat organized, lined up fashion. Now next, let's have a quick look at how we can organize our nodes into groups. And I'm not talking about the groups that we can assign to parts of the geometry inside of our geometry. I'm talking about actually grouping our nodes into group sets, right, that we can hide and show. Up here in the toolbar, you will find the Show Groups option. You can also use Shift-C to open it. And this opens up a little window where we can effectively grab a set of these nodes and add them to a dedicated list. If I grab some of these nodes and then go up to the Add button up here, I can add them to a node group. And this will create a new group specifically for our nodes. Over here we can see how many nodes are present inside of this group. And we can also see which nodes are currently in the group altogether. I find that this menu sometimes gets a little glitchy. Just now I lost control of my screen, so I'm gonna have to wait 1 second for Houdini to catch up. So I just alt-tabbed out of Houdini and it gave me my control back. I noticed this happens sometime. If it does, yeah, just tab out Houdini and tap back in and it comes back. I hope this gets fixed in some of the future versions. I've only seen this happen with this window, so let's hope it doesn't happen too often. What I can do though is I can name some of these groups. So I'll call this one the noise and color group. And then I can hide it using this minus button. I can also show it again using the plus button. And if I click the equals button, it will hide all the other nodes currently in my view. Now if I want to unhide my nodes, I can go to edit and then click on unhide all. And the hotkey for this is Shift E. And this will unhide all of the groups that are currently hidden. So I'm going to delete this group and close the group window. So I click delete. And let's close it. So next what I'd like to show you is how we can change the style of the lines between our nodes. By default, Houdini will start up with this linear style, but we can also change it to a more curved style, and some people prefer this. Personally, I am partial to the linear style, but if we press Shift S, then Houdini will switch up to a more curved style, and we can then see how this can maybe create more organized networks, depending on how you like your styles. If I have a lot of nodes horizontally next to one another, plugging into the same node, it kind of gets a little messy over time. So personally, like I said, I am partial to the linear style. But there's another way how we can organize our lines. Let's get rid of some of this and break these connections. Again, you can use the Y key to drag, select, and delete links between nodes. But if I want to add some dots on these lines, so I can control where these lines go, I can use the Alt key. If I press the Alt key on a line, I create a new dot. And by default, this dot is temporary. If I disconnect this line, the dot gets removed. If I press the Alt key on the dot again, and I disconnect the line, then this dot is pinned and it will stay. And dots act very much like null nodes, except they don't actually cache information. They just act as branching points. So they're even simpler than null nodes. Except of course you can add a name to a null node, so they can be easier to organize. Like we can call this one output of mountain sphere. And we can't do that with a dot like this. Other ways how we can organize our nodes is by giving them a color. Over here on top we have the color palette. You can also access this by pressing C. And the color palette allows us to add colors to our nodes. I'm just going to grab it and scale it up a little bit so it's easier to see. If we grab a node and then click on the color palette, we will change that node's color. Likewise, if we grab a dot, then we will be able to change the dot's color plus the line above it. And if we have a subnet, and we go into the subnet, if we color the inputs of a subnet or a digital asset, then outside of the network, the dot that that input relates to also gets a color. So we can actually color code some of our network links this way. So let's do some quick coloring here, and you can see that if I make the output node red, then the subnet also gets a red output node. So I can quickly make this into quite a little carnival here. So next, I would just like to discuss some of the best practices when it comes to coloring nodes that I like to employ in order to make my networks better to read. I tend to color my nodes based on the function that they have, or what they do to the data that passes through them. And this can be very useful because when you hand off your network to other people, it makes it easier to read. And for me personally, when I'm looking at my networks, especially when they get big, it allows me to see how the data in that network is being processed without having to look at the names of the nodes or have to look closely at the individual shapes of the nodes or the icons. So over here I have a little example set up of some of the practices that I tend to use and that I will be using during the course of this masterclass. So let's start simple and have a look over here on the left. This color scheme is how I tend to color my nodes based on inputs when I delete data and when I output data. So if I were to wrap this inside a little subnet, for example, and call this my little delete node or something, then I would usually color this node red. But if I go inside of this network, the way how I tend to color my nodes is if there's an input inside of a network coming from, say, one of these input nodes, oops, let's reconnect that, then I tend to color this light blue, because this is a data input source. This thing provides data, and to me blue is an input color. Then red, often I use this red color here, is a delete color. I'm deleting some form of data. In this case, I would be deleting whatever piece of geometry is coming in, but it can also count to attributes or when I delete groups. And then this is an output node. I tend to color these black, or at least if I use a regular output node, like these, I don't have to color them black because this would actually affect the color of the output dot on the node. But if it's a null node, then yeah, I tend to color them black. Unless it's somewhere in the middle of a network, then I might color them orange or yellow, because they're in the middle, they're part of the process. If I'm talking about a processing node, or a node that is editing something, like say this node has some parameters I can set from my interface, I tend to color the node yellow. To me, yellow is a working color. So this allows me to easily see, okay, this node has some form of data on it, like parameters, that I can change, and I should remember that. This next node over here allows me to set or transfer groups. I tend to color these green, like a light green, for example, or this type of green. And that allows me to see when I'm working with groups inside my network. This next example here is something I personally like to call my visualizer network. When you're working with tools, and let's say we have created a remarkably complex box, okay, and I want to retrieve the bounding box of this box and show it as an optional little additional piece of geometry, then I tend to create a visualizer network for that. And visualizer networks have the specific purpose to show, say, for example, the bounding box, number values inside my nodes. They can be used to display text. Basically anything, any kind of data that is normally abstract that you want to show, so it makes the tool easier to use. In this case, normally I would merge them together at the end of my network, or perhaps output them at the end of my network as two separate object outputs. Now, if some of these concepts aren't quite understandable to you just yet, don't worry, we'll be going over this in the class. But this way you can see that now I have a wireframe on top of my box here. And if I actually wire this color node incorrectly behind my polywire, and I give it an actual color, like say blue, and now you can see I can actually highlight the bounding box of this box here fairly easily. Okay, let's continue on from this example. In general, what I just want to say is that whenever I have a visualizer network, I tend to either color the surrounding netbox purple or the nodes purple, just to make sure that I know, okay, this is part of my demonstration setup. This allows me to visualize my tool better. Then next, over here on the right, I have these two, and these relate to referencing. So the first one is for object merges, when I grab some data from somewhere in my network and remotely get the data using an object merge. And I tend to color these nodes gray. Plus, I also use the naming convention that seems to be quite common among at least the technical artists that I know, where we have a out context for the node that sends out the data, and then an in context for the node that retrieves the data, the object merge. And regardless of where these are in my network, if they are at the same network level, or if they are inside of another subnet, for example, or in even a different geometry container. This allows me to see which nodes are sending out information to other parts of my network. And then next, over here, we have some data referencing, where I use a dark blue color to indicate the node that carries a form of data that other nodes are trying to read out. Now in this case, I have this transform node on this cube read out a scale attribute from this other network. And this null node here basically just contains an attribute, in this case my scale, and the transform node retrieves that. So if I go over to my scale node here, and I were to change the attribute that's being set on it, the box will scale along. Now I do this to make sure that if I have a reference like this set up, and I have a null node that carries this information that other nodes are reading, I don't accidentally delete it. Because doing that would mean that the transform node can no longer find the attribute that it's looking for, and suddenly it has a value of 0. That would break my network. So these are some of my personal best preferences, and I'll be using this throughout the course. But I just would like to finish up this video by discussing a couple of last fun little details. One of which is the ability to change the shape of our nodes. If we go up here to the shape palette, we can grab some of our nodes and we can actually start giving them different shapes. Now, I don't tend to use this too much, but if we want to, we can color our nodes based on a particular function as well. So let's say I have my noise and color node on here, and maybe I want to give this a fun little shape like this cloud. Well, I can do that. Or I can make it round with the shape here, this round shape. And this tends to change the shape, how the dots are located. Maybe we want an arrow to show that data is being passed through. Or maybe we want to use this explosive symbol when we have a delete node. So, you know, warning, explosion or something. So that's one way how we can also change the shape and style of our nodes. Next, something we've already seen is these netboxes. So let's do this and take some of our networks down here and let's organize them. So I've quickly restored the color on these networks so they don't look as weird. And let's grab this left network and wrap it inside of a netbox. And we can do this by either pressing Shift-O or by clicking on the Create Netbox button up here. And this will create a wrapper around our nodes that we can grab and move around. And we can also minimize it. Plus, we have the ability to also type in this field. So we can call this the noise and color network. And as you saw up here, we can also color these networks. So this allows us to make them even easier to read. Of course, if you use a hard to see color, then maybe it becomes hard to see the network lines. So keep your colors a bit more muted, or perhaps a more darker color, so the brighter elements stand out. It's another idea you can do. And like I said, you can also group parts of a network. So you can put these in the netbox and then minimize those. So we have the ability to take parts of our network and group them using netboxes based on a particular function. Now if you want to put an object inside of a netbox, you can drag it inside of it, and if you drag it outside of it, you disconnect it from the netbox entirely. You can see that the netbox tries to scale itself if you move slow enough, but if you move quickly, you pull it out of the network. So that's one way to control where your nodes are. If a node is behind a netbox, however, it won't move along. So if I just move a netbox on top of a node, I can move them together, sure, but if I just grab the netbox, the node won't come along because it's not actually part of it. The nodes will be a little bit grayed out if they are below a netbox, so you can just grab them and drop them on top, and now they should be part of the netbox. We can actually stack netboxes, but if you do this a lot, then you get some harder to see networks inside, so I don't tend to stack them too much, only when necessary, and often I use colors to differentiate the individual layers to some extent. But again, like I said, the colors overlap and they do become harder to see. And then finally, another thing we can do is add sticky notes. And sticky notes allow us to create little notes inside of our network that we can type text in, such as this is a message about how my tool works. So I have a couple of sticky notes in the example files for the intro assignment, and if you go in there, you can go ahead and read them. So we can put this here, and we can also minimize it. Another thing we can do with sticky notes is we can change their scale by dragging them, or if we hold Shift while dragging them, we will also change the scale of the text. If we right-click the sticky node, we can also change the scale of the text right here. But this will also scale up the sticky node itself immediately, so maybe be a bit careful with that. And if we want to see just the text, we can right-click the sticky node and click on Hide Background. And this can be useful if you just want to have some floating text somewhere in your scene. If you grab the top of the box, you can position it somewhere and it will work like so. And now the last thing that I can mention is how we can create images inside of our networks. Personally, I don't use this too much, but if we go up here to the create a background image button, or if we press Shift I, we can find an image on our hard drive. So let's grab this one. Houdini will now drop an image into my screen. If you press Ctrl I, you have the ability to grab these images and move them. You can also scale them and change their transparency. The moment you press Ctrl I again, they will become permanent background elements and you cannot select them. So maybe if I want to grab some of my networks, I can grab them and position them around these images like so. Just keep in mind that these images need to be on your hard drive for them to be visible. If they aren't on your hard drive, then Houdini won't know how to show them. Now, if you have the Labs toolset installed, you can also get some of these stickers that come with the Labs toolset. So as long as someone else has the Labs toolset installed, they can also have access to these. And if you double click on some of these, like let's say this icon, then now we also have one dropped in the center of our screen. Press Ctrl Y to switch to edit image mode, and then we can move this one around somewhere and position it. So maybe we can put this next to our delete node over here. Just keep in mind that these elements don't actually move along when we grab our networks. So if I press Ctrl Y and I grab my subnet here, it's not inside the subnet. It's actually stuck to the background of my network editor. And the last little tool in the Labs toolset is the ability to paint. So if I click on the paint tool, then I can now start painting inside my screen. And if I hold the Y button again, then I can pick a color from somewhere in my screen and then continue painting with that. I can also use my scroll wheel to change the scale. Just read the description up here if you want to get the entire idea. If we want to get rid of any of these elements, of course, we can press the escape key to cancel or the enter key to store them. And this will turn them into background images just like all the other elements. So let's press Ctrl Y again, and now you see we have, well, a very large background image specifically for our drawing. But with this, we've basically covered everything I would like to show you about how we can organize our networks, how we can navigate the viewport in order to find our nodes, lay out our nodes, and also how we can color our nodes in a way that will make it easier to read the network later on when we have large networks. So thank you for watching this video on how to organize our node networks. And I know that everyone tends to have their own preference on how to color their nodes and how to line up their networks and how they use netboxes. But personally, I find that this works very well for me. And I'll be using the basic color scheme and node layout styles throughout this masterclass. So I just wanted to explain to you why I laid them out this way, so you have a better time reading my networks later on. Alright, so at this point, we are pretty much ready to get started on the Houdini Foundation module. And I might release more videos in the Houdini 101 series in the future, and I will add them after this video. But if you want to continue and you want to start working on the building project, then feel free to continue with the Foundation module at this point. So I hope to see you there, and thanks for watching this video, and have a good one.